In this video, I'm going to be bringing you my collector's guide for the Sega 32X. So as you guys may be aware, I do have a full Sega 32X collection of the US library. And so in this video, I'm going to be going over my collector's guide, kind of talking about the 32X unit and all of the games released in the US for it, as well as a couple reproduction / homebrew games made for it. And I'll go over those at the end of the video, so definitely stick around if you want to hear about those. First off is the system. It's basically an attachment for the Genesis and Sega CD. And so this is the back of it. It does have a cartridge slot on the front. It does have pass-through on it, so you can leave this docked on your console at all times and play Sega Genesis through it, Sega Genesis games. So a couple things to know about this is Sega released primarily two power cords, power packs if you will. There's one that was made for the Sega CD and Model 1 Genesis, and another one made for the Model 2, Model 3, as well as the 32X. And those have a yellow end on them. So if you're looking for OEM equipment, you're looking for a power cord that has a yellow end. It's a little bit of a smaller tip. The back of the unit has two ports. One is an AV in, one is an AV out. Very important to know that the AV, basically a linked cable that goes to the Sega Genesis. What happens is AV comes into this, it gets processed with this processor and gets outputted to your television. There are two styles of link cables. There's one for the Model 1 Genesis and there's one for the Model 2 Genesis. The 32X does not work on the Model 3 Genesis. And so this is what the cable looks like for a Model 1 Genesis for the 32X. So this end plugs into the 32X and this end plugs into the Model 1. This is an aftermarket cable. The OEM cables actually have a breakaway piece kind of here where it's this piece. It's basically this to a Model 2, and then this is kind of as a breakaway adapter for the Model 1. But if you're looking at OEM or even aftermarket cords, just make sure that if you have a Model 1 Genesis, the bigger end is what you need for the Model 1. If you have a Model 2, then it's basically the same size connector on both sides. There is also, if you have a Model 2 Genesis, there is basically a neck plate that sits on here so that it conforms to the Genesis more. There's also metal clips that you can put into the Genesis to kind of ground the unit out. Personally, I do not use those. They help with interference for RF connections. So if you're using like an RFU adapter, you may want to use those, but I use AV for everything, so it's not an issue. I don't get any interference with the AV. So that's the add-on as a whole. You do need a Genesis Model 1 or Model 2 to use it. Now I'll go ahead and go over all of the games. Like I said, the Genesis games do play through it. I'm not going to cover any of the Genesis games in this video. However, I am going to cover all the 32X games released, and there were also a very small set of 32X CD games released, which require the Sega CD, 32X, and Genesis combo to play those. So I'll be covering those towards the end of the video as well. First off is Afterburner. And if you watch my previous collector guides, you know that I have custom cases for everything. As I go through, you won't see any OEM cases, but you'll see custom cases for all these games. So Afterburner, it's an okay game. Definitely not the best port of the game. Most of these games you will be able to pick up really cheap for the most part. There's a couple expensive ones, and I'll touch base on those, as well as, in my experience, kind of what the rarity was. Afterburner is a really easy game to obtain. Next up is one of the more expensive games to obtain. It's not that hard to necessarily find it. It's just very pricey. It is Spider-Man Web of Fire. So this game, last time I checked, was going for between $250 and $300 loose. A complete copy, I think, is $400 to $500. And it's mainly because it got a limited print run, and it was the last title released in the US for the 32X. At the time of this release, the Saturn was already out in Japan, and so the 32X was basically dying off in the US. Like I said, easy to find. You'll find tons of copies on eBay. You're just gonna have to pay a premium if you want to buy it right away. They only made, if I remember right, they only made 1,500 copies of these, and so it's not, like I said, it's not hard to find. It's just expensive. People that have them are definitely willing to sell them. It's just you'll be paying a premium. I've never seen this at a flea market, at a garage sale, anything like that. But definitely a game to keep an eye out. Gameplay wise, I definitely do not recommend it. I've tried playing it several times. It's definitely not the best Spider-Man game. I've played much better on the Sega Genesis. It's more of just a collector piece. If you're a complete collector, like I am, and you want to complete the set, obviously it's there. Next up is another interesting game, BC Racers. So this is kind of a prehistoric racing game where you're on, like stone bikes, racing around track. The gameplay overall is okay. I like that, you're riding around, you can swing items at other people, try to knock them off the track. However, there is parts of this game take place at night and you cannot see a thing. It's way too dark and it's just unplayable on the night tracks. A game that's pretty cheap to pick up. This one should not cost you that much. Next up, we have Blackthorn. So Blackthorn will probably be one of the more expensive games. I believe I paid around $35 to $40 for this one, probably about 1.5 years ago. But it is more difficult to find than some of the other games. And so I actually got this from DK Oldies when they decided to stop selling 32X games. So at that time it actually retailed for, I think, $65. And they clearanced out all their games. I think I ended up actually paying around $25 for this one. They had everything at like 80% off. They just wanted to get rid of all their 32X inventory. And so I went ahead and picked this one up from them. It's a really fun game. This was also released on the Super Nintendo. It's kind of Prince of Persia-ish meets kind of like a Doom, where you basically, you carry around a shotgun. You can single-hand it and, shoot people, but it's more of a dungeon feel. It really does play like a Prince of Persia. I actually really like that. That's probably one of my favorite games on the 32X. Next up is Brutal Above the Claw. If you're familiar with the Brutal series, there's a couple of these available on other Sega platforms like the Genesis, like the Game Gear. Pretty neat game. Nothing too special about that. This one's about $10 to $15. This shouldn't run you too much. And again, all these prices are at the time of the recording of this video. I always suggest checking price charting or Game Value Now or eBay sold listings to see what current prices are. Next up is Cosmic Carnage. This is basically a fighting game. It's actually pretty decent. It's not the best fighting game on the system, but it is pretty decent. Plays kind of like a Mortal Kombat or a Tekken. Next is Doom. So, it's Doom. It's a good game. There are other better ports of this game. PC version comes to mind as better, but for what it is, it's a really good game. This is probably the first game I ever played on the 32X. It's got, you can really see the polygons in it, but it's definitely recommended. This game shouldn't run more than $5 to $10. And then we probably get into one of the worst games for the system. This one is Fred Couples Golf. This game is horrible. I'm sorry. There's just, I don't even know how to describe it. It's a golf game, early 90s golf game. Honestly, I've been spoiled by Golden Tee. So any time I try to play this game, it's so difficult. Trying to navigate between clubs, trying to judge where you're shooting. Putting is horrible in this game. But again, another game that is really cheap to pick up. In fact, if you're buying a 32X on eBay and used, you may get it in a lot with this thrown in for free. Because it's a more common game. It's not that great. It should only run a couple bucks loose. Next up, the only Sonic type game to make it on the 32X, Knuckles Chaotix. This is probably my favorite game on the system. It is phenomenal. A lot of people criticize it because of the gameplay. It has a rubber band style gameplay, but once you get past that, it is an awesome game. I actually like the rubber band gameplay. I think it really adds to the uniqueness of the levels, you know, getting to different areas. I think it's awesome. So definitely recommend this one. This is a little bit, it's not hard to find, it's just a little bit more pricey in the $40 to $50 range. Next up is another game in that $50 range, Colibri. This is basically a shooter where you're a hummingbird kind of flying through the air shooting at other insects and things like that. But it's a unique gameplay, but it's actually a really good game. Next up, we have Metalhead. This is, I believe, the only mech game on the system. There might be one other one, but it's okay. There's not too much to say about this one. Overall, it's pretty decent. Not the most expensive game on the system by any means. I think this is around $10. Next up, Mortal Kombat 2. So this is obviously a port to the system. Mortal Kombat 2 was released on the Sega Genesis. This one just enhances the graphics a little bit. Other than that, it plays the same as the Sega Genesis one. And then next up we have Motocross Championship. This is another one that will probably be included free with a 32X adapter. This is probably the cheapest game for the system, along with Fred Couples Golf. It's actually not too bad. It's a kind of a dirt bike racing game. Overall, not too bad though. Next up, NBA Jam Tournament Edition. Obviously, NBA Jam is one of my favorite games. This one is really good. It is a port of the Genesis version to the 32X. Definitely recommend that one. And not an expensive game at all. Probably $5 to $10. Another one of those cheaper games is NFL Quarterback Club. This was released on the 32X. Interesting thing about this game is if you look on the back, it's 5 players. It's very interesting. 1 to 5 players. For whatever reason, they decided to make it a 5-player game. Next up, in my opinion, one of the hardest games to find for the system, Pitfall. Pitfall can range anywhere from $60 to $100 loose. This was the very last game I got to complete my set. It actually came down to me buying, it was either Blackthorn or Colibri, I believe, in this game, and I chose the other one. And it ended up taking me about 9 more months to even find this game pop up on eBay. I have an eBay watcher that'll notify me anytime there's a listing for 32X, and this game never popped up. Eventually it popped up for, I think, $65, so I jumped on it just so that I could complete my collection. But if you ever see this, I definitely recommend picking it up. It's not the best game. You can play it on the Genesis. It's pretty much the same thing. It's available on almost every platform, but for whatever reason, the 32X version is really hard to come by. Primal Rage. It's basically Primal Rage. There's nothing special about this one, but it is a pretty cool game. You know, another one of those fighting games. Rbi Baseball 95. Another cheaper sports game. So nothing too special about this one. It is a licensed game. It goes along with the other RBI games released for the Genesis. Next up is Shadow Squadron. This is kind of a like a space flight game. There are other games better than this on the 32X. One of them is a reproduction, which I'll go over towards the end of the video. But overall, this one's not too bad. There are some Star Wars games that are much better than that, though. Space Harrier, not the best port. If you're going to play this game, I would actually skip Space Harrier on the 32X, and I would actually play Space Harrier 3D on the Master System if you have a Master System. But not an expensive game at all. Next up, there is Star Trek. So this is Starfleet Academy. If you're familiar with the Genesis, there were 2 Star Trek games on the Genesis. This kind of goes along the lines of those. Not bad gameplay. For the price, $20 to $25 is generally what this game goes for. Next up, probably one of the best games on the system is Star Wars Arcade. The gameplay on this game is phenomenal. This is probably one of the games that actually made this add-on somewhat of a success. Overall, the add-on was a pretty big failure in the US, but that was mainly around timing. But this game really helped it. Next up, here is another mech type game. It's T-Mech. This is actually a lot better than the other one. This one is more tank based. It's very good. There's basically 6 different tanks you can use on that one. Next up is Tempo. This one's kind of okay. Tempo is a pretty cheap game. It's available on other Sega platforms as well. Like the Game Gear got Tempo Junior. Tempo's available on the Genesis as well. Tough Man Contest, boxing game. Not the greatest. There's definitely better boxing games on other Sega platforms, especially the Genesis. Alright, next up is one of the best games on the system, and it's actually better, in my opinion, than the Sega Saturn version, and that is Virtua Fighter. In my opinion, the polygons on the 32X are so much better than the Sega Saturn, and it really stands out in this game. If you play the Sega Saturn version and compare it to the 32X version, you'll definitely see what I mean. Definitely, I recommend this game. Tons of replayability in this. You know, if you're not familiar with Virtua Fighter, it's similar to a Tekken. The best, in my opinion, the best game on the system. Next up is Virtua Racing. And so this was released later than obviously the SVP chip for the Genesis. So if you're familiar, Virtua Racing for the Genesis was, I think, the most expensive game for the Genesis. It was a $100 game, and that's because it had the extra chip in it. When the 32X came out, they were able to port it over, and so Virtua Racing for the Genesis now is really cheap. It's only $1 or $2. The same pretty much applies to Virtua Racing for the 32X. I actually like the 32X version better. It's still not the greatest racing game for the time, but it's pretty good. Next up is the second most expensive game for the 32X. I'm not sure why. The game isn't that greatest. It's not the greatest game out there, but it's pricey. And it's World Series Baseball featuring Deion Sanders. So this game took me a while to get. This game retails for about $110 card only. And so, not sure why, but just to give you an idea, I paid around $100 for the game, I believe. And it came with the case. Since I do my own cases, I actually traded away the case and manual for, I think, $75 worth of games. So definitely, it's definitely on a pricey end. A lot of collectors are trying to get that case and manual. So if you have that, definitely you have some trade bait there. Next up, we have a couple wrestling games. First up is WWF Raw. This one has a pretty small roster on it. It's not too bad compared to some of the other Genesis wrestling games. And the other one, which I actually like this one better, is WrestleMania the arcade game. This is a port of the WrestleMania arcade game. And then we've got two more, actually one more retail Genesis game, and then, or 32X game, and then we'll get into the 32X CD games. And this is Zaxxon Mother Base 2000. This is another port. It's an okay game. If you're familiar with Zaxxon's Mother Base 2000, it's decent. There are some better games out there. And then we're going to get into the 5 US released 32X Sega CD games. And so let's go ahead and start with the first one, which is Corpse Killer. This game was released on other platforms as well. It is a single CD game, and here is what the CDs kind of look like. You can see they do say Sega CD 32X on them. And some of these are multi-disc games. Next up we have Fahrenheit. So interesting about this game is it never actually was released in solely a Sega CD or CD32X format. What they did is they released it for both systems at the same time, and so it was a dual disc set. And so essentially you use both discs for the 32X, or you just use the first disc for regular Sega CD. And then one of the most controversial games of all time, Night Trap. This is the censored version. The uncensored version was only on the Sega CD. And so, again, 2 discs, both required. Obviously, there's a lot of FMV in this game. Next up is Scottie, Pippen, Slam City. And this is a very large game. This is actually a 4-disc game. It is the only 4-disc game for the Sega CD, I believe. Yeah, this is the 32X version. Lots of full motion video in this one. And then the last one released was another dual disc game, and that was Supreme City. So those were the 5 Sega CD 32X games. They're pretty easy to come by. They're not too expensive. They're all probably in a $20 to $30 range. And then the last 2 things I have here were basically unreleased in the US. And so the first one I'm going to cover is Darkseid. This game was only released in Brazil. It's extremely hard to come by. I believe the last time I checked, I want to say these were going anywhere between $500 and $1,000 for the Brazil version, but you can't play it on a US console. This version you can. So this is a reproduction version. Go ahead and show you the cart. You can get these on Etsy. there is a person on there who has basically region unlocked it. It does have the English translations on it, so you can play the game in English. And so this is the only way to play it on a US system. And this game is phenomenal. This is one of my favorite games on the system. And the final game is a port of a Genesis game. It was never released. And then a group of people got together that realized the game actually did get finished, and they they took the ROM, created some games, physical cartridges for it, for Cowlitz Gamers for Kids. And that is Spot Goes to Hollywood. And so all of these were numbered. So I have number 3 of 35. There were only 35 of these made, of the physical carts. And here you can see it has the Cowlitz for Gamers logo. And it was, they printed the books for them. And they printed, unfortunately I wish they would have done 32X carts for them, but they put them on US Genesis cartridges. And so the one I have was actually, they used an Acclaim cartridge on it, and it 8-Bit Evolutions was the company that did it, or the organization. And so these were only available to 35 people at the Cowlitz for Gamers show. And so really excited to have that one. I'm not a big fan of Spot Goes to Hollywood, but this is just one of those collector pieces that is great to have. This will probably be, if you're trying to find this, it'll be the hardest game to find. Generally, the people who got it at that show are collectors. I was fortunate enough to get this on eBay. Being on the East Coast, I was not at the show when this was released and sold to individuals, but I was able to pick this up on eBay. Ever since I got it, I've been keeping an eye out for more copies and haven't seen any pop up, which is to be expected when there's only 35 copies out there, and most of the people that have them are collectors. And so that's it. That is the that's what a complete 32X collection looks like. So that's my collector's guide. Drop me a comment below. Let me know if you have any questions about any of these games. Like I said, I do have a full collection, as I just showcased, of every game released in the United States. I have played all of these. So if you have any questions, comments, just let me know. And thanks for watching.